Picture the year 1408. A ship arrives in Norway carrying a letter from the very edge of the known European world. It was a completely routine piece of correspondence from the Norse settlement in Greenland, mostly just describing a recent wedding that had taken place at Valsey Church. The letter casually noted the weather conditions, local trade, and just the everyday affairs of the colony. There was absolutely nothing in it to suggest an impending catastrophe. Yet this incredibly mundane letter would be the absolute last communication Europe would ever receive from the Greenland Norse. For centuries, this settlement had stood as a resilient outpost of European civilization in the freezing Arctic, and then it just vanished. In this explainer, we're undertaking a forensic descent into one of history's most chilling, perplexing mysteries.
Think about that deeply disturbing contrast for a second. On one hand, you have the joyful, utterly ordinary event of a wedding. People are planning for a future, building their lives, and then a sudden, impenetrable wall of silence. For the next 150 years, no ships came from Greenland. Not a single letter arrived. When European explorers finally managed to return in the late 16th century, what they found was a ghost colony. Farmsteads were completely deserted, the stone churches stood entirely empty. Personal belongings, tools, and clothing were just left sitting inside houses, almost as if the inhabitants had simply walked away and never looked back.
The sheer scale of this mystery is what makes it so incredibly haunting. We aren't talking about a small, temporary hunting camp here. Approximately 5,000 Norse settlers vanished. This was a complex society that had survived and even thrived in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth for over 400 years. Yet when investigators searched, there were no mass graves, there was no definitive archaeological evidence of large-scale warfare, no signs of a massacre, or even a sudden disease outbreak that could account for that level of mass death. An entire established European colony was completely wiped from the historical record, leaving behind nothing but the wind whistling through the empty windows of their stone cathedrals. Which brings us to part one, the archaeological and climatic evidence of the collapse. Because to even begin to understand how an entire society is erased, we have to look closely at the physical evidence left behind in the dirt and the ice. We're going to forensically examine these deserted ruins, relying on modern data to piece together the final, agonizing decades of Norse Greenland. Where the ice cores tell us is a story of relentless environmental strangulation. See, the Norse originally colonized Greenland during the medieval warm period, a brief era that made their European-style farming marginally possible. But around 1300 CE, the climate brutally turned against them. The Little Ice Age set in, temperatures plummeted, and the sea ice drastically expanded. The crucial metric you need to understand here is the growing season. It dropped from about 150 days around 1200 CE down to fewer than 100 days by 1400 CE. This cooling climate systematically suffocated the Norse agricultural model. It made the hay farming they desperately relied upon to feed their livestock entirely unsustainable. And the physical evidence left in the ground paints a grim picture of a society enduring a slow, agonizing starvation. Skeletal analysis actually reveals that the Norse settlers became progressively shorter over generations due to severe chronic malnutrition. We see signs of tuberculosis, osteoporosis, and bone deformities consistent with dangerous inbreeding as their isolated population shrank. But the clues we find are maddeningly contradictory. At some farms, tools were carefully stored away, which suggests an orderly, planned departure. But at others, highly valuable silver jewelry was just left behind, and the bones of livestock show that animals simply starved to death right in their pens. And the most troubling detail of all, the few excavated graves we found only account for maybe 1% of the final population. So where are the rest of the bodies? Moving into part two, cultural rigidity, the Norse and the Inuit. Climate change alone simply cannot solve this mystery. As we examine the findings of modern historians, we uncover what was likely the fatal flaw of the Greenland Norse, a rigid cultural identity that actively prevented their own survival. There is a deeply fatal juxtaposition at play here. The Norse stubbornly insisted on maintaining a strict European identity. They built grand, stone, Catholic churches. They stubbornly tried to raise cattle and sheep in an increasingly frozen, hostile landscape. But right next to them were the Thule Inuit, who had migrated into the exact same environment around 1200 CE. And the Inuit were highly adaptable. They used sophisticated marine hunting techniques. They tailored their clothing specifically for the Arctic, and as a result, their population actually expanded during the Little Ice Age. When Europeans finally returned in the 1500s, the Inuit were absolutely thriving right next to the freezing, abandoned Norse farms. And this brings us to the ultimate forensic question. Why? Why did the Norse colonists stubbornly refuse to adopt the survival strategies of the Inuit, who were successfully living in the exact same environment? Historians argue the core issue was profound cultural inflexibility. The Norse literally preferred to die as Europeans rather than live as the Inuit, whom they viewed as pagan and inferior. Their commitment to their specific identity, their European housing, their diet, their social hierarchy, became completely maladaptive. They clung to an identity that ultimately killed them. Part 3. The Lost Colony in the Western Imagination. You see, the story of the Norse doesn't actually end with their physical demise. We're pivoting now from the archaeological ruins to a fascinating sociological analysis. Drawing on Robert Rix's extensive research, we're going to explore how this historical blank spot, these vanished 5,000 people, became a massive canvas for Western literature. As detailed in Robert Rix analysis, these missing Vikings essentially morphed into a ghost story for the ages, because the exact final fate of the colonists couldn't be physically proven. Later European and American writers flatly refused to accept that the colonists had simply perished. For centuries, major expeditions were funded, not just for exploration, but under the explicit delusion that the descendants of these colonists were actually still alive. They believed they were just hidden away behind an impenetrable wall of sea ice, somehow continuing to live out a medieval European existence. Arthur Conan Doyle actually captures this literary appetite for the unknown perfectly. Doyle, who had served as a surgeon on an Arctic whaler himself, used to muse about whether the lost colonists were still singing, fighting, or if they had intermarried with indigenous populations. He ultimately concluded that the mystery was better left unsolved, writing, "There is nothing so artistic as a haze." The completely unsolved nature of these ice-imprisoned Vikings provided the perfect, unwritten pages for writers to project their own cultural fantasies onto the Arctic landscape. But in Part 4, Imperialism and Racial Myths, we see how this literary fascination takes on a much darker reality. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, this artistic haze was systematically weaponized. American and British imperialists began using the myth of the lost Norsemen to serve aggressive, highly racialized political agendas. Crucial to understanding this weaponization is the concept of translatio imperii. This is the ideological belief that empire and cultural supremacy transfer linearly from one great people to the next. British and American commentators began positioning their own modern nations as the direct biological and spiritual heirs to those Viking conquerors. By claiming the vanished settlers as their literal ancestors, they essentially rationalized that the Arctic already belonged to them by blood right. It became a profound, fabricated justification for modern imperial territorial expansion. Exploring historical archives, we uncover a massive genre of adventure fiction that completely exploded during this era. Novels by authors like Fitzhugh Green and James Hogg depicted protagonists journeying into the Arctic and miraculously discovering hidden, racially pure Viking utopias. These fictional colonies were often placed near the North Pole, which, bizarrely, was falsely believed to be a warm, open sea at the time, and they were explicitly presented as a deliberate antidote to what authors perceived as the cultural and racial decay of modern urban society. These texts are literary imperialism in action. They acted as profound compensatory fantasies, at a time when eugenics and deep anxieties about immigration and cultural weakness were peaking in the West. This lost colony provided a dreamscape of unadulterated whiteness and primitive vigor. The adventure writer wasn't just exploring ice, they were mapping out racial entitlement. The Vanish Norse were used as a mirror to mass colonial anxieties, attempting to prove that Western civilization had a divine, historical right to conquer the furthest, most brutal reaches of the globe. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, a cold warning from history. When we strip away all the adventure novels and the imperial propaganda, we are left with a profoundly chilling parallel at the very heart of this mystery. We are looking at two distinct forms of hubris, separated by centuries, but linked by the exact same psychological flaw. Consider the deep historical irony here. The original 15th century Norse died primarily because they clung to a rigid, inflexible European identity that was entirely unsuited for a rapidly changing environment. Centuries later, 19th and 20th century European and American imperialists clung to the myth of those very same Norsemen for the exact same reasons of cultural hubris. They used the dead colonists to prop up their own rigid, inflexible beliefs in racial and imperial superiority. Both groups, separated by time, chose to enforce a fabricated identity upon a reality that fundamentally rejected it. And so, we are continually drawn back to the stone ruins of Havelsø Church, and to this haunting reality, despite all the subsequent literary myths and the grandiose imperial fantasies. The absolute fate of those 5,000 people remains unknown. Did they die quietly in the dark of starvation? Were they lost at sea attempting a desperate escape? We may never have the full answer, but their disappearance stands as a stark, undeniable warning about environmental limits and the fatal, ultimate cost of cultural inflexibility. When human settlement encounters a change in climate, and a society refuses to adapt its identity to survive, what history